Released in 1933, Lullaby Land was received as an innocent experiment within the Silly Symphonies, but today it reveals something far more uncomfortable. In this video, you'll learn 14 unsettling facts that make this short disturbing by modern standards, including the true role of the Forbidden Garden, the threatening transformation of matches into conscious creatures, and the Sandman's ambiguous function as a late-arriving solution. Somewhere between a child's dream and a visual nightmare, the enchantment breaks quickly, and it all begins exactly where it shouldn't. The first warning ignored by a child sleeping alone. Fact 1. The Forbidden Garden is not a metaphor. It is a functional threat. Unlike other children's shorts of the era, the Forbidden Garden in Lullaby Land doesn't function as an abstract symbol, but as a dangerously literal space. The scene presents scissors, knives, pins, nails, and giant forks filling the frame without comedic stylization. They don't gain friendly faces or cartoonish movement. They remain sharp, rigid, and silent. This choice creates immediate discomfort because the setting behaves like a real environment, only enlarged. The baby enters without any clear moral transition, and the film offers no visual signal that this is meant as a lesson. The absence of bright colors or soothing music reinforces the feeling of irreversible error. When the stuffed dog comes to life, voiced by Pinto Colvig in the first and only credited instance, the script doesn't use the character to neutralize the danger. It suffers as well. For a 1933 audience, the scene was seen as educational. Today it feels like raw exposure to risk, without emotional filtering. And this discomfort establishes the true tone of the short before any actual nightmare even forms. Fact 2. The matches act as collective entities, not objects. When the child opens the box of giant matches in Lullaby Land, the short crosses a rarely discussed narrative line. The matches don't function as isolated accidents, but as organized forces. The scene shows dozens of them igniting, marching, and advancing together, filling the frame in a coordinated way. There are no facial expressions or obvious humanization, just intentional action. Visually, they behave like a conscious group, something unusual even for the Silly Symphonies. This choice turns a mundane household item into a true antagonist. Behind the scenes, this sequence was conceived by Wilfred Jackson as a visual climax, exploring one of childhood's most primal fears, fire out of control. Frank Churchill's score accelerates, but it doesn't warn. It accompanies, almost normalizing the threat. The contrast creates discomfort. There is no verbal lesson, no adult figure stepping in. The danger only resolves when the fire turns into smoke, opening the way for something even worse. This logic makes it clear that the short doesn't teach caution. It exposes the mistake and lets fear speak for itself. And that completely changes the modern adult reading of the scene today. Fact 3. The Sandman arrives too late to be comfort. The Sandman's appearance in Lullaby Land is often remembered as relief, but a closer look shows the opposite. He only appears after the baby has passed through real danger, a living fire, and constant pursuit. Visually, there is no build-up for his arrival. He simply enters the frame, interrupting the threat without addressing the trauma the sequence has built. The character is presented as a magical figure wearing solemn clothing and using broad gestures, but his narrative function is to erase the chaos, not prevent it. This creates a strange imbalance. Fear plays out fully, the solution lasts only seconds. Voiced by George Gramlich, the Sandman doesn't communicate with the child or acknowledge the danger that was faced. He ends the dream as if nothing had happened. Behind the scenes, this choice followed the Silly Symphonies logic, where music and rhythm dictated the ending, not the emotional arc. Today, this structure feels cold. The short doesn't teach safety. It teaches that help arrives after the damage. And that idea, planted in an apparently innocent cartoon, is what makes this scene age in such a deeply unsettling way. Fact 4. The dream has no adult witnesses, and that is a conscious decision. In Lullaby Land, no adult appears inside the dream to observe, guide, or intervene. The mother disappears right after putting the baby to sleep, and her absence is never replaced by another authority figure. On screen, this choice creates a completely autonomous space, where risk is neither moderated nor explained. The framing reinforces this by keeping the baby isolated, always small in front of giant objects, with no return to the safe world until the very end. This isn't a narrative mistake, but a clear option. Behind the scenes, this structure followed the experimental model of the Silly Symphonies, on where emotional logic came before direct moral messaging, something the Walt Disney Studio itself defended at the time. Without adults, the short forces the child to cross danger alone, turning the dream into a trial rather than a game. For 1933 audiences, this sounded like imaginative independence. Today, the total absence of adult protection makes the dream feel less playful and more like a silent nightmare, reinforcing the accumulated discomfort up to this point in the narrative. Fact 5. The stuffed dog doesn't offer safety, it only confirms the danger. The stuffed dog that accompanies the child in Lullaby Land is often interpreted as a comfort figure, but direct observation of the scenes reveals the opposite. It doesn't guide, doesn't anticipate risks, and doesn't react strategically to threats. Visually, the character enters the Forbidden Garden with naive curiosity and immediately suffers the consequences, reinforcing that the space allows no mistakes. Instead of easing tension, its presence doubles the sense of vulnerability because the baby loses the only possible emotional anchor. Behind the scenes, Disney was still experimenting with breaking expectations in companion characters, testing situations where the emotional object failed as protection. This narrative decision avoids easy comfort. If even what is meant to represent safety is neutralized by the environment, the silent message is clear. In that dream, there is no real shelter. This subtle inversion deepens the short's discomfort without resorting to explicit violence. Fact 6. The smoke turns into boogeymen without any moral transition. When the matches finally go out, Lullaby Land could have ended the danger there, but the visual choice goes in the opposite direction. The smoke generated by the fire doesn't dissipate. It condenses and takes on its own form, giving rise to the boogeyman. The scene ignores any childlike logic of cause and effect. There is no lesson learned, no correction of the mistake. Visually, the change happens without warning, with the figures emerging from nowhere, larger than the emotional frame the narrative had built. This creates strangeness because the danger doesn't diminish. It only changes its appearance. Behind the scenes, this sequence reflects the experimental phase of the Silly Symphonies, when the studio explored surreal transformations as emotional climaxes before standardizing safer structures. And the decision to replace fire with pursuing creatures amplifies the terror instead of closing it. For audiences at the time, it was exaggerated imagination. For modern eyes, it feels like continuous punishment, where each mistake generates an even more abstract threat. And this reinforces the uncomfortable sense that the dream never intends to offer real relief, only the evolution of fear. Fact 7. The music acts as a contradiction, not as emotional guidance. In Lullaby Land, the soundtrack doesn't warn the viewer when danger approaches. While the images show living matches, chases, and creatures emerging from smoke, the music remains light, almost hypnotic. This disconnect creates unintentional tension because the ear doesn't prepare the brain for what the eyes are seeing. On screen, there are no musical pauses in the most threatening sequences, no clear shift in tone to signal imminent risk. Everything continues as if the dream were still safe. Behind the scenes, this choice reflects the musical philosophy of the Silly Symphonies, where the score was designed as continuous flow, not as moral commentary. The music guides rhythm, not awareness. The result is unsettling. The viewer recognizes the danger before the cartoon itself admits it exists. Today, this contrast feels almost cruel. Instead of protecting a child audience, the soundtrack dulls the warning, making the visual impact more direct and uncomfortable. The final sensation is that something is wrong, but the film refuses to say so out loud, deepening the silent strangeness. Fact 8. The visual pace only accelerates when the danger is already irreversible. And in Lullaby Land, the pacing of the images remains steady during the dream's exploration, even when signs of danger are already present in the frame. Sharp objects, potential fire, and threatening shadows appear without urgency, almost normalized by the editing. The visual acceleration only happens when the situation is completely out of control, such as during the chases with the matches and boogeymen. On screen, this creates a sense of narrative delay. The warning comes too late. The viewer perceives the risk before the film does. Behind the scenes, this structure reveals editing decisions typical of the early Silly Symphonies, when the studio prioritized musical flow over psychological development. The edit followed the music, not the logic of fear. The side effect is unsettling. The short doesn't build tension progressively, and it denies danger until it becomes unavoidable. Today, this choice feels disconnected, almost irresponsible. The dream doesn't warn, doesn't slow down, doesn't offer an early exit. It simply speeds up when there is no possible return, reinforcing the feeling of total loss of control. Fact 9. The short was born in a period without child safety filters. Lullaby Land was produced in 1933 before any solid standardization of what was considered appropriate for children in animated cinema. At that time, there were no strict internal guidelines about fear, trauma, or visual intensity in children's shorts. The Silly Symphonies functioned as a creative laboratory where the studio tested ideas without a direct commitment to emotional comfort. The focus was on technical, musical, and visual innovation, and not on the psychological protection of the audience. This explains why sequences with live fire, sharp objects, and prolonged chases passed without formal objection. There was no active censorship or later narrative revision after production. Only decades later, with the brand's maturation and the creation of a recognizable Disney standard, did works like this begin to be re-evaluated through a different lens. Today, the short stands out precisely because it exposes a raw phase of the industry when children's entertainment wasn't yet treated as a sensitive territory. The modern discomfort isn't an accident. It's the direct result of a creative system that didn't yet worry about distinguishing imagination from real threat. Fact 10. The film was promoted as educational, not as dark fantasy. When Lullaby Land reached theaters in 1933, it was marketed as a short with an educational purpose, aimed at reinforcing basic notions of child safety. Promotional materials from the time highlighted the idea of a visual warning about everyday dangerous objects, not the aspect of dreamlike terror. This institutional framing softened the initial reception and shielded the short from harsher criticism. The problem is that the visual execution never truly matched that message. Instead of showing consequences in a didactic way, the film chooses to expand fear, prolong danger, and resolve everything abruptly at the end. Over the years, this discrepancy became more evident. Animation historians began pointing to the short as an example of misalignment between industrial intent and narrative result. What was sold as a lesson ended up functioning as raw exposure to risk. Today, this contradiction is central to the discomfort the short provokes. It doesn't just feel dated, it feels miscategorized from its very origin, which helps explain why its modern reinterpretation differs so sharply from its original reception. Fact 11. The short was quietly pulled back over the decades. Unlike other Silly Symphonies from the same period, Lullaby Land didn't remain in constant circulation over time. After its original release, the short disappeared for long stretches from regular screenings, reappearing only sporadically in special showings or historical compilations. This withdrawal wasn't announced as censorship, but it was never fully explained in an official way either. Behind the scenes in the industry, works with ambiguous tone were often set aside to avoid uncomfortable interpretations. While other children's shorts were rerun on television and in educational materials, Lullaby Land had limited circulation, gaining the status of a curiosity. Only decades later, with the rise of collections aimed at adult audiences and the historical study of animation, did the short return to broader discussion. Today, this irregular history reinforces the perception that it never quite fit into the institutional image built later. The silence around its absence speaks as loudly as an explicit ban, suggesting an unacknowledged but persistent discomfort. Fact 12. The short gained new meaning when adults began to analyze it. For decades, Lullaby Land was treated as a minor curiosity within the Silly Symphonies catalog. That changed when historians and adult fans began rewatching the short outside of a child-focused context, and especially after its re-release in historical collections. Under this new lens, elements once considered exaggerated imagination started to be described as uncomfortable, aggressive, and emotionally harsh. The lack of emotional processing, the prolonged exposure to danger, and the abrupt resolution drew attention in modern analyses. Unlike forced reinterpretations, this shift in perception happened organically, driven by debates about how early sound animation handled fear in children's entertainment. Without the need for official scandals or public controversies, the short developed a strange reputation, not banned, but often accompanied by contextual warnings. Today, it functions less as a children's product and more as a raw document of an experimental phase in the industry, when there was still no real concern for psychological impact. This audience shift is what makes its existence so unsettling today. Fact 13. Fear is not resolved, it is only interrupted. The final scene of Lullaby Land ends the conflict abruptly, without emotionally rebuilding what was broken throughout the dream. Visually, the baby returns to the crib as if nothing had happened, but the short never shows any sign of real relief or consolidated learning. Everything simply stops. The danger isn't confronted or overcome, it's switched off. On screen, this creates a strange sense of suspension, as if the narrative were cut in the middle of a trauma. Behind the scenes, this resolution reflected a common logic in early sound shorts. The ending obeyed musical duration and screening time, not a complete psychological arc. There was no concern for showing emotional processing, only technical closure. Today, this kind of ending feels incomplete. The adult viewer realizes that fear was accumulated, amplified, and never digested. The dream doesn't heal, doesn't protect, and doesn't teach. It simply ends. This feeling of rupture between intense experience and empty closure is one of the elements that most contributes to the short's modern discomfort, setting the perfect stage for the final fact. Fact 14. It was never reimagined, only archived. Unlike other old works that received revisions, adaptations, or reinterpretations over time, Lullaby Land remained exactly as it was originally conceived. The short didn't undergo corrective edits, narrative adjustments, or attempts at visual softening in later decades. Instead, it was simply moved into the realm of historical preservation. Behind the scenes, this strategy is often applied to productions that carry too much structural discomfort to be modernized, but enough documentary value not to be erased. By not being reworked, the short preserves its original logic intact, with all its excesses and ambiguities. This makes it function today as a raw portrait of a phase when children's animation still didn't clearly distinguish between fantasy, fear, and warning. The unsettling part isn't only what appears on screen, but the fact that nothing was done to recontextualize this experience for later audiences. The editorial silence around the work turns Lullaby Land into something rare, discomfort frozen in time, still causing unease precisely because it remains untouched. As rewatching Lullaby Land today isn't just revisiting an old cartoon. It's confronting a raw phase of children's animation. The short exposes fear without preparation, danger without mediation, and solutions that arrive too late. It wasn't made to disturb, but over time, that's exactly what it ended up doing. The discomfort remains because nothing was softened, explained, or corrected afterward.